So hello and welcome to Paper Bullets, two artists who risked their lives to defy the Nazis. Thank you for joining us tonight. My name is Isabella Rowan and I am the program coordinator here at Delray Beach Public Library. Tonight's special event is part of a series of programs presented in conjunction with the Americans and the Holocaust exhibition. Delray Beach Public Library is one of 50 libraries selected by the United States Holocaust Memorial Museum and the American Library Association to host the Americans and the Holocaust traveling exhibition. The exhibition is on view here at the library through November 17th. It's already been up for 5 weeks and there's only 1 week left. So if you're local and haven't had a chance to come in and view it, please make time to do so. It does close next Wednesday. Through historical images and text from original sources, this interactive exhibit examines the motives, pressures, and fears that shaped Americans' responses to Nazism, war, and genocide from 1933 to 1945. And even as we are winding down the exhibition and program schedule, there are still some excellent programs coming up, including another Zoom event tomorrow night at 7 o'clock. World War II and the Diverse Lives of America's Fathers examines the impact World War II had on fatherhood and the American family. It wasn't all leave it to Beaver and father knows best. This will be a fascinating look at dads and their changing roles and responsibilities in the 1940s and early 50s after the war, presented on Zoom by Ralph LaRossa, PhD, Professor Emeritus of Sociology at Georgia State University. I put the link to register in the chat. You should be able to see it, and you will receive the Zoom ID after you register. I hope you'll be able to join us. Our special guest tonight is Jeffrey H. Jackson. He is a professor of history at Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee. An expert on European history and culture, he is the author of Paris Underwater, How the City of Light Survived the Great Flood of 1910, and Making Jazz French, Music and Modern Life in Interwar Paris. He has appeared in documentary films and helped develop Harlem and Montmartre, a Paris jazz story, for PBS's great performances. Tonight, he will talk about his book, Paper Bullets, just released in paperback this month. It is available for checkout here at the library with your library card, or you can purchase your own copy from our partner, Murder on the Beach Mystery Bookstore right here in Delray. Paper Bullets tells the unknown and captivating story of two French women who from 1940 to 1944 executed an audacious anti-Nazi campaign to undermine the German troops occupying their chosen home, the British Channel Island of Jersey. Drawing on their avant-garde background, they wrote and distributed Paper Bullets, wicked insults against Hitler, calls to rebel, and subversive fictional dialogues that amounted to their own PSYOPs campaign. But wait, let's hear the story from the author himself. Let's give a warm cyber welcome to author and professor Jeffrey H. Jackson.
Well, thank you so much. Thank you so much. Can you hear me okay? That's such a warm welcome and warm introduction. And thank you so much, Isabella, for that. And good evening, everyone. Thanks for tuning in and joining to hear more tonight about Paper Bullets. I am coming to you live from the beautiful campus of Rhodes College in Memphis, Tennessee, where I teach. I wish, of course, that we could all be together. I wish I could be with you there in Delray Beach, but thanks to the magic of the internet, we can meet and join, and perhaps more safely in some ways still because of the circumstances. But I do appreciate you taking the time to tune in tonight. And it is really such a delight to be part of this series organized by Delray Beach Library. The series of talks that's in conjunction with the Americans and the Holocaust series. I think it looks like a wonderful roster of events that you've had. The one next time sounds fascinating. I'd love to hear that talk myself. And it's also great to be working with and partnering with a civic organization like the Delray Beach Library, because I think now more than ever, we need vibrant civic groups and organizations like this library. So thank you so much for the invitation. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. And if there's a problem here, Isabella, you can let me know. But what I'm going to do for the next 30 minutes or so is I'm going to tell you this powerful story of resistance and perseverance in the face of grave danger by two amazing French artists that forms the heart of my book, Paper Bullets. And in the course of this, I'm going to read a few excerpts from the book as well, just to give you a sense of how I tell the story and of the drama behind it. And I've lightly edited these excerpts just for clarity's sake for our context tonight. So I want to go ahead and jump right in and introduce you to the two women who I write about in the book. They're remarkable women. And if you know something about the history of art, and especially the history of photography, you may have heard of them before. But even if you do know their photographic work, you may not know much about the story of how and why they fought the Nazis for 4 years. Now that story that I'll relate to you tonight has inspired me over the time that I've written this book, and it's inspired many others that I've told it to over the years. And so I'm so glad to be able to share it with you tonight. So please meet Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe, two of the most unlikely Nazi fighters that most of you probably have never heard of. They were Parisian artists. Lucy was a writer and Suzanne was an illustrator who had studied in art school when she was young. And together, the two of them collaborated on what people in their own day saw as sometimes shocking photographs. They were friends with and influenced by many of the great modern artists in Paris of their day, people like Picasso and André Breton, Salvador Dali, Jean Cocteau, and many others. But Lucy and Suzanne turned images of gender and identity on their heads. More than anything, that's what they are known for today. And if you do know them, you actually know them by some different names, their artistic names, but I'll say more about their names in just a moment. But after they left Paris and left the art world behind, they put their skills as artists to work fighting against the German army on the island of Jersey, which is one of the British Channel Islands just off the French coast. They used their creative powers to get inside the heads of the soldiers. In brief, here's how it worked. They used their, Lucy and Suzanne created a PSYOPs campaign, a psychological operations campaign, designed to demoralize the soldiers, telling them that the war was a lost cause and trying to convince them to go home to their families. And they did it in a very unexpected way, with notes and messages, reports, news reports from the BBC, drawings, songs, bawdy jokes, and provocative slogans, most of them written or typed on little slips of paper like the one that you see on your screen. And they left them around the island for the Germans to find. And in some cases, they even put those notes directly into the pockets of the soldiers themselves. So now I'd like to read the first excerpt for you tonight. And this is the beginning of the book, the opening scene, in which we find them distributing some of their notes. On the morning of July 25th, 1944, Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe went into Saint-Hélier to do some shopping. Their trip was part of their regular routine. Outside the offices of the Jersey Evening Post, they glanced up at the large clock at the top of the building. Suzanne leaned in and whispered to Lucy to keep watch. Then Suzanne scanned the long row of police cars the Nazi occupation forces always parked along Charles Street, a reminder of how heavily the Germans censored the island's only newspaper. Suzanne took a small piece of paper out of her pocket and began moving carefully toward one of the police cars as Lucy stood by on lookout duty. Suzanne stuck the gummed paper on the windshield. It read, "The cowardly bureaucrats of the police who live on lies and shameful cruelty will be destroyed by the soldiers with no names." And no one seemed to be paying any attention to the middle-aged women in Burberry trench coats with bright scarves tied around their heads. Suzanne quickly attached papers to a few more windshields and casually strolled away, her Wellington boots thumping on the pavement. If anyone asked the women what they were doing, their shopping bag would provide an easy alibi. After finishing their secret mission, along with some mundane errands, they met up with their housekeeper, Edna, and boarded one of the wood-burning buses to head back home on the other side of the island. Lucy held a package of cigarette papers that they had just bought at the newsstand. These papers were destined to become a new batch of notes for the Nazis. In her pocket, alongside more of their notes, Suzanne could feel the bright blue milk of magnesia bottle, but it did not contain the digestive medicine, but instead an overdose of the powerful barbiturate Gardinol in case the Germans caught them in the act. With no warning, the bus came to an abrupt halt and a fair-haired soldier climbed aboard. "Everyone off the bus," Lucy clutched her parcel a bit tighter. Outside, the soldier approached each commuter. Suzanne noticed his bright blue eyes. Please show me your papers. How old are you? What is your occupation? Where were you born? Where do you live? How many children do you have? With his critical eye, the German carefully looked over each passenger's documents until satisfied, saying very little other than what was necessary to get his answers. If something was suspicious or if passengers had forgotten their documents, they were told, someone will visit you in your home. Then the soldier approached Lucy and Suzanne. Lucy recalled the scene several years later in a scrapbook of notes that might have formed the basis of a memoir if she had lived long enough. She titled these reminiscences, "The Mute in the Middle of the Muddle." Show me your registration card, the German demanded. He stood in front of Lucy, glaring at her. A look of recognition crossed his face when he saw a familiar name, Schwob. What kind of name is that? The document listed French as her national origin. She explained nervously that she was an orphan and raised by a Frenchman. Perhaps you were Alsatian. Maybe, she replied, but admitted that she didn't really know. Lucy stated that she had been on Jersey for some 30 years. But nearly everything she had just told the German about herself was a calculated lie. She invented a new backstory for herself, and not for the first time. As the minutes ticked by, Lucy waited patiently next to the bus and watched the soldier scrutinize her documents. Suzanne and Edna were close by but could do nothing to help. Lucy, perhaps coughing or stumbling a bit, played sick for the German's benefit, brushing off her acting skills from her Paris days when she took part in avant-garde theater productions. Finally, the soldier handed back Lucy's papers. When he wrapped up his examination of all the passengers, everyone reboarded the bus. An acquaintance riding with them tried to break the nervous tension created by the ordeal. They have not caught you this time, she said, laughing, unaware of what Lucy's parcel of cigarette papers was destined for. Now, I'll tell you more about how they did all of this in just a minute, but first I want to tell you a little bit about their background, because one of the questions that I had to think about as I did the research for this book was to ask, why would two women with so much to lose put their lives on the line in the way that they did? And also I had to ask myself, what was it about who they were that gave them the strength and the power to become resistors? Because after all, most people did not become resistors during World War II. A part of the answer to those questions lies, I think, in their personal histories. Lucy and Suzanne grew up around the turn of the 20th century in the southern French city of Nantes as daughters of wealth and privilege. Lucy's father was a newspaper owner and editor, and Suzanne's was the head of the medical school and a well-known physician. So they were never starving artists, even when they moved to Paris as young women in their 20s, just after World War I, to pursue their artistic careers, because they always had family resources. One reason they did not become famous in their day, even in the art world, is that they never really needed to publicize their work in order to make money. Now, they were known in certain circles, such as among the surrealists with whom they were friends, but for decades they were largely forgotten until being rediscovered in the 1980s. Yet to become resistors, they would need to give up the privilege and the comfort that they were born with. But why would they? Well, I think there were some key aspects of their life stories, which, although they did not know it at the time, would set the stage for their resistance against the Nazis. And first of all, Lucy's father's family was Jewish. Although he was assimilated and didn't practice the faith, Lucy embraced elements of her Jewish identity that were taught to her by her grandmother. There were also several rabbis and scholars of Jewish life in the family. Now, Lucy was 4 years old at the height of one of the worst anti-Semitic episodes in modern French history, the Dreyfus Affair. Now, that's a complicated story and we don't have time to go into it tonight, but suffice it to say that it led to crowds outside the family's apartment shouting, "Down with the Jews." Later, when Lucy was 12, she was attacked by other children in school who pelted her with rocks and anti-Semitic taunts while she lay helpless on the ground. Lucy and Suzanne both would remember those horrible days, and the memory would fuel their hatred of fascism and their willingness to fight it. A second factor that allowed them to become resistors was the fact that they were in love. Lucy and Suzanne had met as young girls in the elite circles of Nantes society and played together from childhood. By the time they were teenagers, they began a relationship that was in tension with a conservative French Catholic society that valued respectability. Most people in France at the turn of the century did not see a lesbian couple as respectable. And their connection was made even more complicated by the fact that in 1917, Lucy's divorced father married Suzanne's widowed mother, making the girls stepsisters. But their feelings were powerful. Lucy wrote in a thinly veiled article published in a Nantes-based literary journal that her feelings for Suzanne were her idée maîtresse, her main idea, and her guiding principle. I am in her, she is in me, and I will follow her always, never losing sight of her, Lucy wrote. And if you notice this illustration on the right-hand side of your screen that Lucy drew, you see their initials at the top, LS and SM, Lucy Schwob and Suzanne Malherbe, but the initials are all run together into those three letters, LSM. And if you pronounce that phonetically in French, LSM, it becomes the sentence, they love each other. And drawing on their own experiences, Lucy and Suzanne also explored gender and sexuality as fluid and changing categories. And this is one of the things that they're most famous for today. In fact, they're not, as I said before, they're not known in the art world as Lucy and Suzanne, but rather by the gender neutral artistic names that they took, which you now see on your screen, Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. Now, they assumed these names to create new identities and to cross gender lines. Claude in particular is a name that's used by both men and women in French. Cahun put it this way in a memoir that she published in 1930. Masculine, feminine, it depends on the situation. Neuter is the only gender that always suits me. If it existed in our language, no one would be able to see my thoughts' vacillation. So gender was for Cahun situational and conditional, fluid depending on the moment. Lucy's new name was also, it also allowed her to express her Jewishness. In fact, it was as much about Jewishness as it was about gender. Cahun was the name of one set of Lucy's grandparents, and in particular, the grandmother who taught her about her Jewish heritage. And Cahun is the French version of Cohen, the Hebrew for priest. So like many other artists of their day, they created work then under these newly assumed names. But these identities also allowed the women to slip the trap of traditional bourgeois society. Yet they always still called one another Lucy and Suzanne. Those are the names on their tombstone, and the historical documents are very clear on that point. We tend to call them, and people who've studied them before tend to call them Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, but that's because we know them through their artwork. And yet the documents, the historical record is clear that it's much more complicated how they referred to one another. So if you've seen their work under these names of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore, then you know of the ways in which their photographs depict Lucy as Claude Cahun in gender ambiguous dress or pose, playing with notions of masculinity and femininity, in some ways helping to invent the notion of what we would now call queerness, long before our current understanding of that idea was created. In fact, many queer and transgender people today see them as early heroes and role models. Their photos deconstructed gender categories, showing them to be masquerade and performance decades before most scholars would take up those questions. Cahun put it this way in her autobiography. She wrote, "I shave my head, wrench out my teeth, my breasts, anything that is embarrassing or annoying to look at, stomach, ovaries, the brain, conscious and covered in cysts," suggesting that altering gender and sexual identity was part of the goal, and so was creating a new sense of self. Indeed, the musician David Bowie, well known for his own gender ambiguity, mentioned a posthumous 2007 show of Cahun and Moore's photography on his own personal blog. He wrote, "I find this work really quite mad in the nicest way." Now, that ability to cross gender lines will become crucial in their fight against the Nazis. So keep that in mind as I speak further. So Lucy and Suzanne spent the 1920s and most of the 1930s in Paris, but they decamped to the island of Jersey, one of the British Channel Islands, in 1937, when they were both in their late 40s. They had vacationed on Jersey many times over the years, so its beaches and its natural beauty were familiar to them. And I should say, on a personal note, I visited Jersey in the course of the research for this book, and I can totally understand why they would want to go there. Jersey is a beautiful place. It's wonderful. I had a great visit, and I highly recommend going to Jersey. It's a lovely spot. Jersey was also a perfect respite for Lucy's chronic ill health. She had a number of medical conditions through which Suzanne had helped to nurse her over the years. And also Paris at this point had become deeply politically polarized by the 1930s, with various groups literally fighting in the streets. And with fascism on the rise across Europe, Jersey offered a peaceful escape. So when they left Paris and when they left the art world behind, they largely stopped using the names Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore. and returned almost exclusively to their birth names, Lucy and Suzanne. And that's part of why I refer to them in the book as Lucy and Suzanne rather than Cahoon and Moore, because I'm dealing mostly with their post-Paris lives. Little did they know, however, that when they moved to Jersey, they were stepping into what would soon become a war zone. When the fighting broke out in Poland in 1939, Jersey seemed far away from the action. But by 1940, the Channel Islands would become the front lines. The islands were the only piece of British soil that the Nazis conquered, and they were crucial to what Hitler called his Atlantic Wall, which you can see on the map on the left-hand side of your screen. The Atlantic Wall referred to a line of defense in the West designed to keep the Allies at bay. So thousands of German troops soon arrived in Lucy and Suzanne's adopted home to build fortifications, which would be used to protect the continent from Allied assault. It was so important that Hitler personally received regular updates from the islands. No dissent could be tolerated in such a strategically important location. But dissent is exactly what Lucy and Suzanne did. Back in Paris, they had been involved in left-wing politics, befriending communists and other radicals. They had signed petitions and open letters against the rise of fascism and protesting anti-immigrant legislation. Lucy had written a letter to a magazine supporting gay rights. So by the time they arrived on Jersey, they had been rebels for some time. Add to that, their own lives as lesbian partners lived in opposition to the mores of their day, and their provocative artwork that challenged notions of beauty and gender identity. Ultimately, all of the strands of their lives came together to not only give them the strength to resist the German occupation of Jersey, but to give them the skills to do so. They put their creative talents, their political inclinations, and their personal backgrounds into their work, and it gave them the tools to fight back. Resistance was not an afterthought, but the peak and the point of their creative lives. Most importantly, their love kept them going as they supported one another through what were some very scary and stressful moments. I really don't believe that either of them could have done this work alone. Just as with their artwork, their resistance was something that came out of their relationship and out of their love. Now, as I said before, their desire to resist led them to write notes to the Nazis, something that on the face of it seems small and even inconsequential, but the notes they wrote were powerful indeed. All of these messages were designed to demoralize the troops, or to convince them to desert or to mutiny or to go back to their families in Germany. And the German army took them very seriously. For 4 years, the secret field police, which was tasked with keeping order in occupied territory, tracked them, trying to find out who was leaving these notes all around the island. Sometimes the agents would find them on fence posts, sometimes on cafe tables, sometimes tucked into magazines at the newsstand, sometimes placed inside German staff cars, and sometimes even in their own pockets. The women even hung a sarcastic banner over the altar at the church near their house where some of the soldiers worshiped that read, "Jesus is great, but Hitler is greater, because Jesus died for people, but people die for Hitler." And what they were doing with these messages and with this banner was scaring the German command into believing that a conspiracy was afoot on the island, this strategically important zone about which Hitler received regular updates. Was there someone on the island threatening the Atlantic Wall that protected Hitler's conquered continent from Allied attack? The notes only served to stoke the Germans' paranoia. And now I'd like to read another excerpt from the book. This is the scene where they are arrested. During the quiet dinner, a fist pounded at the door. It was the moment Lucy and Suzanne had been expecting every day for nearly 4 years. The only question was whether the Germans were clever enough to have discovered the women on their own, or if someone had ratted them out. Suzanne got up from the table, walked to the door, and pulled it open. Having studied these men carefully from afar for a long time, Lucy and Suzanne knew that they would not be smiling. 5 men stood on their doorstep, including Chief of the Secret Field Police, Captain Boda, and a fair-haired man with bright blue eyes who wore mustard-colored +4s. Suzanne greeted them with a simple "good evening." With a surprising graciousness, the fair-haired man clicked his heels and made a deep, respectful bow from the hips. "German secret police," Suzanne remembered him announcing politely. "We've come to search your house." Boda strode to the window seat and made himself comfortable, perhaps puffing on his cigar, while the fair-haired man, whom the others called Carl, started to run excitedly back and forth throughout the house. They ransacked every corner, pulling out all the drawers, prying into every nook and cranny of Lucy and Suzanne's lives. From his perch, Boda watched with suspicion as the 2 tired women Their faces slightly wrinkled and hair graying stood by. Too late, Lucy announced in English, knowing that these men did not speak French and herself unable to speak much German. Germany has already lost the war, she proclaimed. Lucy and Suzanne remained calm, but their maid Edna panicked as the men ravaged the house. She knew everyone in the household had been breaking German regulations by hoarding food. Perhaps she worried that she had let something slip about their illegal radio. Carl came over to Lucy and stared her down. "And what do you think will happen to you? You tell me that," he shouted in his calm and polite demeanor, his calm and polite demeanor at the door now gone, as the adrenaline from the thrill of the chase pumped through him. "I think that you will probably torture us and shoot us afterward," Lucy replied flatly, as though she had always known and accepted that this would be the outcome. Carl was stunned silent. These women were not hysterical or even surprised by a raid on their house, but were already anticipating their own deaths. I believe that until that moment, he had thought us unaware of the risks we had been taking, Suzanne reflected. Carl looked at Boda and then back at Lucy and Suzanne. "But we never do that kind of thing," he proclaimed indignantly. "That is BBC propaganda." Lucy glanced back at him, raising her eyebrow in disbelief. Now, the notes that frightened the Germans the most were the ones that Lucy and Suzanne signed, but they didn't sign them with their own name, but rather with the name of an author that they invented. They created a fictional persona and pretended to write messages from that perspective in German, since Suzanne was fluent. But the persona was significant. They called him the soldier with no name. In other words, they crossed gender lines, once again, this time in effect becoming, so to speak, a German soldier. When they wrote these notes in this male German voice aimed at the other soldiers, they made the secret police believe that the threat was coming from within the German army itself. And this was one of their innovations. Note writing was not unique to them. There are many cases of people living in German occupied territory and even within Nazi Germany itself, writing notes as a form of dissent. But most of those notes were aimed at the civilian population, reminding them to keep their spirits up or calling on them to resist the Nazis. As far as I can tell, Lucy and Suzanne were nearly unique as civilians, aiming their notes at the German soldiers. The only real parallel was the Allied PSYOPs campaign, which dropped German language leaflets behind enemy lines, encouraging soldiers to desert or to surrender. What Lucy and Suzanne were doing here was rewriting the inner transcript, or what the political theorist James C. Scott calls the hidden transcript, that the Germans told themselves about how the war was going. They were getting inside the minds of the soldiers and sowing seeds of doubt and dissension, spreading ideas that they hoped would, as we might put it today, go viral among the troops. If a German read their notes signed by the soldier with no name and believed that they really were written by a comrade, Lucy and Suzanne hoped he might think twice about what he was doing on Jersey. Maybe he would even mutiny or desert. Now, of course, I don't have time to tell you the whole story here tonight, but suffice it to say that they were indeed arrested by the secret field police, as we heard in the last excerpt. They were interrogated. They were put on trial on November the 16th, 1944, almost 77 years ago next week, 77 years ago next week. They were sent to prison and they were sentenced to death. And so I'd like to read a third excerpt, and this is the excerpt of their trial. The judges and lawyers convened in large imitation leather armchairs on one side of the table. Lucy and Suzanne's chairs placed opposite the Germans were so large that the women could not use the armrests without spreading themselves unnaturally wide. So Suzanne rested her hands in her lap. Lucy, thinned by illness and lack of nourishment, was curled up in one corner of her chair like a child who climbed in a seat made for a large adult. Behind them were two rows of spindly gilt cane chairs. Captain Boda, wearing a white jacket and smoking his cigar, balanced on one of them. On a table lay all the items confiscated during their raid, including their Philips radio, their Underwood typewriter, their Kodak camera, 2 guns, books, articles published by Lucy's father, one of Suzanne's wooden crosses that Lucy had planted on a soldier's fresh grave, pieces of fabric, and a few of the coins on which the women had painted "Down with War" with nail polish. These once familiar things now seemed strange, so out of context in a courtroom rather than at home. This collection looks like a sort of junk shop, Lucy Riley thought. Also on the table sat Boda's fat file, which was packed with their notes. The approximately 300 scraps of paper now entered into evidence were only a fraction of what they had produced, 1/20th, Lucy claimed. Her estimate was different from what Suzanne recalled, but of course, neither had really been counting. The other noteworthy feature in the room was the 3/4 length portrait of Hitler that hung over the fireplace. He appeared to be presiding over the trial. Lucy recalled the large windows of the courtroom, filled with sunshine from the beautiful day outside, even describing the room as hot. What a luxury, she thought, compared with their cold prison cells. 2 large, comfortable armchairs in the front row next to one another. What a delight. We are at the show, Lucy remembered with more than a bit of sarcasm. The decor, the actors did not disappoint us. Rather than reading the indictment or inviting the prosecutor to begin, the chief judge, Oberstabsrichter Harmsen, began by questioning Lucy and Suzanne in German about their responses during their interrogations. Then he asked about some of the evidence he felt had been ignored, peppering the women with a string of additional queries. Any previous convictions? Harmon asked. Have you ever appeared before a court? Never, Suzanne answered in German, speaking for both herself and for Lucy. Harmsen turned the proceedings over to the prosecutor, Lieutenant Lung, so that he could make the formal case against the women. And for the next few hours, he did just that. Lung began by focusing on several of their leaflets and messages to the German troops. One of those was their darkly funny version of a heroic song. The interrogator had asked them about it, and Suzanne had not denied that it crudely shamed German women and embarrassed German men. When it came time to pass sentence, Harmsen was blunt. You are franc-tireur, he declared, using the French term for guerrilla fighters or irregular military shooters, even though you used spiritual arms instead of firearms. He gave a brief summary on why their actions were so significant and why he had condemned them as dangerous political criminals. It is indeed a more serious crime, he claimed. With firearms, one knows at once what damage has been done, but with spiritual arms, one cannot tell how far-reaching it may be. Lucy could not help but think, we couldn't have put our defense any better ourselves. Now, even during their time in prison, Lucy and Suzanne kept up their efforts at defying the Nazis. As they befriended guards and they passed notes and they comforted other prisoners. The book is full of surprising episodes of what took place in those moments. German guards, both frightening and humane, prisoners keeping one another's spirits up with singing, Lucy and Suzanne smuggling notes to one another, tales of German deserters being hauled off to their execution, leaving the women to wonder when their turn before the firing squad would come. But there's one story in particular that stands out because I think it highlights how important their relationship, their love story, really was to making all of this happen. As Lucy was being interrogated by the secret police, she made a stunning admission. She blurted out, I am on my father's side of Jewish origin. She admitted to being an unregistered Jew living in Nazi-occupied territory, thereby putting herself in grave danger. Then she confessed to the supposed crime, telling her interrogator that she wrote all the notes by herself and that the whole thing was her idea. She was trying to convince her interrogators that she alone had the motive to become the soldier with no name. But in reality, she was not claiming credit for their work as the true mastermind behind the campaign, as some scholars have believed. In fact, Lucy knew just how much of their resistance Suzanne was responsible for. Lucy wrote that it was more often me who accompanied Suzanne, she who took the initiative, which required the most sang-froid. Instead, Lucy's calculated risk in admitting her Jewishness was an attempt to take the fall and to save Suzanne. If the police believed that Lucy alone had a motive to write their notes, then the woman she loved might somehow get off. Lucy and Suzanne survived the war, but they had to work hard to make sense of it. What had it all meant? After all, they did not drive the Germans from Jersey with their notes, but in some very important personal ways, their effort was a success. And it's something that speaks to us today about the power of creativity and imagination and persistence, especially in trying times. I think they've left us with a story about how even small acts of protest and refusal can have significant effects that are hard to see until later. And they remind us why history matters. Because in the midst of our present day difficulties, a pandemic, deep political polarization, economic uncertainty, we can look back to the stories of people who had it far worse, but still somehow survived. Now, I want to close with a final excerpt from the book where I talk about Lucy, how Lucy and Suzanne tried to make sense of what they had gone through. After the war, one day in Saint-Hélier, Lucy and Suzanne encountered a woman whom they had never met before. She stopped them and proclaimed, "I'm so happy to see you alive." Several others also gathered around to greet Lucy and Suzanne. They were in disbelief to learn that the women had survived their ordeal. It must have been a dreadful experience, the woman continued. Now you must forget all about it. Lucy and Suzanne were left dumbfounded by her blithe advice. Later, Lucy sat in her bed, leafing through a stack of papers. Next to her on a small table where she placed her tea tray sat the square hat box one of the German guards had given to her last August as a place to keep her personal items. Other than her memories, the miscellaneous mementos inside this box were all she had left of the months behind bars. Of all our baggage, she said, that hat box was the only one that had any value. She determined that she would organize all the prison communication, letters and drawings and notes between her and Suzanne. Few of the documents from earlier in their lives had survived the occupation of their home by the Germans. She speculated that the soldiers had used them to light fires in the fireplace. Lucy gave some papers to a friend on Jersey, and she sent a few other items to friends back in Paris, but the ones with the most personal meaning did not leave that box. The memories were too precious. When Lucy couldn't sleep, she reread the notes that Suzanne had written to her during their prison stay, some of them on sanitary napkins, and felt strangely nostalgic. But as the days went on, her thoughts began to darken. Lucy had always been the more pessimistic of the two, prone to depression and suicidal feelings, and her gloomier meditations in the aftermath of the war echoed that part of her personality. She later wrote about how she had become possessed in those days by an overwhelming fear that all of her struggles had been for nothing, that there were no greater lessons to learn from all the experiences she had lived through. Suzanne's suicide attempt, their home plundered, illness, death. Lucy likened herself in her reminiscences to a repeat offender Lazarus, rising from the dead over and over, only to witness still more suffering. Throughout the years that followed, she wrote about the war in lengthy letters to friends and in early drafts of what might have become a memoir had she lived longer. These writings were not the sort of quest for personal identity that she had composed as a young woman in the 1920s and 1930s, but were rather an attempt to make sense of what the war and their time in prison had meant in broader, more universal terms, despite her underlying fear that there was no such meaning to be made. But there had been a point to what they did. Lucy wrote in a 1950 letter, from July 1940, the invasion of Jersey, until May 1945, the liberation of the Channel Islands, yes, even in prison, even in secret, I wrote to encourage men, including the German soldiers, to liberate themselves. Whether such self-liberation took place was easy to doubt, yet there were occasional glimpses of something that might offer a larger perspective and a sense perhaps of vindication. In January 1946, for example, Suzanne received a letter in German from a POW military hospital. It was from Heinrich Ebers, one of the men who had guarded Lucy and Suzanne in prison. Surely German jailers did not typically write to their former inmates. His family was alive and in good health, he reported, and the British were treating him well. He asked Suzanne to greet Lucy and to write him back. In some strange way, perhaps Heinrich, the German guard, had liberated himself and wanted them to know it. Lucy and Suzanne had liberated themselves through their resistance work too. Lucy in particular had struggled with the question of identity her whole life, from her youth in an assimilated Jewish household during the heat of the Dreyfus Affair, to her struggles with her mother's mental illness and her own poor health. Her early writings as Claude Cahun were inwardly focused in a tortured, extended attempt to answer the question, who am I? Which neither her book nor her evolving self-presentation or her numerous aliases and her radical politics could ever really seem to resolve. She was always looking for more. But Lucy finally found her identity through The Soldier with No Name, and so did Suzanne. The war was the one moment in their lives when they seemed to have the strongest sense of purpose and the most direct vision about who they wanted to be. Against the Nazis, there was a moral clarity and certainty, which their earlier work did not always have. The Soldier with No Name finally liberated them to speak as loudly and as distinctly as they wanted. Well, that's the end of my presentation, and if we have any questions, we can certainly take some. I just also wanted to say, though, a quick, not only additional thanks, but a shout out to Murder on the Beach Mystery Bookstore. I always love to support local booksellers, and so they have copies of Paper Bullets available, and if you're interested and would like to find out more, you can visit Murder on the Beach Mystery Bookstore, as well as the Delray Beach Public Library, and check the book out. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen, and we can certainly take any questions. And I don't know, Isabella, are you going to moderate the questions to see what we've got here?
Yes, I will.
Okay.
I will moderate questions and comments if anyone has anything. It looks like we have Janice, who says that your book is fascinating. And I agree with her, definitely. Are there any other questions? Let me change the view so I can check for hands raised here.
It looks like
May I
Janice
ask
might
a
have her
question?
hand up.
Janice, you have a question?
Yeah, I was just wondering how you got turned on to this story and if others had written it. I've been reading a number of books and now I'm going to read your book, which to me are like unusual stories from World War II. And I'm wondering why they're occurring now. Are we just discovering the diaries of these people, or how did you get so much detail about these two women?
Right, that's a great question. There's sort of both the practical side and there's also kind of the broader issue about why we're discovering these stories. And so maybe I can sort of address
Yeah, please. There's two questions.
in terms of my own path to this story, my wife is an art historian. And so she knew about the photographs that, and I showed you some of the photographs in the presentation, that these women under the names of Claude Cahun and Marcel Moore produced, because folks within the art world, and especially the world of photography and avant-garde work, have known about them since, like I said, in the 80s, they started to kind of be rediscovered as photographers. And so more and more they've been talked about. And so when my wife said, you should look at these photos, I always listen to my wife. And so I started looking at the photos and I thought these really are remarkable images. They're scary, they're disturbing, they're beautiful, they're strange, they're amazing, they're inventive, they're all sorts of things. And I've only shown you a few here tonight. You can find many more on the internet and in museums and so forth. So I became intrigued. And as I started looking into their story, what I found was that by and large, what had been written about them was coming from the sort of art history perspective and kind of looking at the visual art, as well as the gender issue, right? And their own sort of story as a lesbian couple that had become more and more interesting to folks. But really nobody, for whatever reason, had really looked at the wartime story. And I think sort of once they left Paris, they sort of left the orbit of, the kind of stuff that folks in the art history world are interested in. And I think people sort of saw this later work as kind of an afterthought or a footnote or kind of and also there was this, part of their life. But for me, all of their work is of a piece. I think you have to look at their Paris work and what they did on Jersey, including all these notes, as all kind of their artistic work. So I think some of it has to do just with kind of people's interests and scholarly interest, had kind of focused on the earlier time. In terms of my own work in doing this, I think the other reason why maybe that they hadn't been talked about as much is that the archives, I had to go to archives on both sides of the Atlantic. I had to go to Jersey, of course. I also did work in London at the National Archives. And then there's also a collection of their papers that has ended up at Yale University as well. And so I went up there and spent some time at Yale to look at this. So I've been the one apparently who's been willing to go to all these places and to cast this wider net that other folks just haven't done it. But I think it goes then to the larger question that you pose about why we're hearing these stories now and why we're getting more and more of these stories. And I think some of it is that historians, myself included, and others, we're trying to broaden out how we think about the past, how we think about history, to sort of bring in voices that have really not been heard. And as I was telling Isabella before we began the event, I sometimes talk about this as the World War II story that you've never heard before. Because we focused on, especially in World War II, we focused a lot on the big picture story. And there have been clearly heroic stories of individuals, but that tends to come from the perspective of soldiers. And so I think as historians, we just asked other kinds of questions and said, well, who else, should we be looking at? What other kinds of stories are out there? I think that we're starting to see more and more of those kinds of things. And so, I wasn't necessarily looking for that kind of story, but once I saw it and once I realized what it was, I said, aha, I need to pursue this story because it's an interesting story. Not much has been written about it. And it does sort of open up this larger kind of question about, what other stories are there out there about an event that we think we know everything about. But in fact, there's much more to be said.
Yes. Yeah. Thank you. Thank you for writing this book.
Sure. Thank you. That was a great question.
Are there any other questions? I have one.
Okay.
So was it proven that they were like someone ratted them out, or were the Nazis just that smart to finally track them down?
It's hard to, it was hard to find a sort of a smoking gun, so to speak, you know, a kind of clear evidence, but what does come through even from their own post-war writing and their own reminiscences and some of the conversations that they had with the guards or with the agents who arrested them, was that someone had in fact turned them in, had ratted them out. You know, what happens on Jersey during the war and the other Channel Islands, there's 7 Channel Islands, is that on the one hand, there are a lot of people who end up working with the Germans because there are hundreds and hundreds of German soldiers on these islands. As I said, they're strategically important as part of the Atlantic Wall. So there are lots of soldiers on these islands. And so what happens is that people have to work with them. That's sort of just to get along. There's sort of no way to avoid it. And yet at the same time, there were other people who were also engaged in some kind of resistance work. Lucy and Suzanne did not join with them. They did their work on their own. But there were other people who were engaged in resistance. And yet at the same time, there were also people who were not only sort of working with the Germans, I mean, you know, in terms of like doing labor for them, but also collaborating with them and turning in people, in part because the Germans incentivized it. I mean, you could get money for turning in somebody, for example, who was listening to an illegal radio, because at one point radios are banned. And you would get a reward if you turned in somebody who was listening to an illegal radio or doing some other illegal activity. And there was at least one person, and I mentioned her in the book, and other scholars have mentioned her, so I'm not outing anybody or, you know, revealing some new information, but there was one person in particular who became infamous for over and over again turning people into the occupation force. And she just became infamous among the local population because she was always turning people in. And of course, from her perspective, she was trying to make her way through this, through this horrible circumstance. I don't know if she was the one who ratted out Lucy and Suzanne or not. I don't know exactly who it was, but somebody did. But there were definitely people, who were working with the Germans in that capacity. So there are a lot of different responses. And part of what I also try to do in the book to provide some context for this wartime experience is to try to talk about, the varieties of those different wartime, what's happening on Jersey during the war, because it's not a simple story. There are a lot of different things that are going on, and Lucy and Suzanne's work is one part of a bigger story.
Wow. I can't imagine the stress that their neighbors and friends and the townspeople were under in that situation. It's mind-blowing to me.
Right. And then on top of everything, there was a forced labor camp just down the road from their house. So the Germans were bringing in slave laborers from Eastern Europe, in part to build the fortifications that were part of this Atlantic Wall. So, I mean, they were, and then right across the street from their house was the officers' social club. There was a hotel across the street from where Lucy and Suzanne lived, where the officers would socialize. So they were literally surrounded by German troops, across the street, down the road, at the slave labor camp, everywhere. And even out on the beach in front of their house, there would be some of these forced laborers would come out and like reinforce the seawall and do some repair work. And they encountered some of them there and tried to talk to a few of them and give them some gifts and give them some things to help these men who had been forcibly brought to the island. So I think stress, absolutely. There's a lot of, there are a lot of opportunities for them to trip up and to get caught or to be found out, or to just, somebody happens to look and see what they're doing. And yet they did this for 4 years, and sort of undertaking that every day, making that choice every day to live this way. And for them, it was about, principle, and it was about values, and it was about, a choice that they undertook.
Amazing. It's an amazing story. Does anyone else have any questions? We're going to wrap up here in just about 3 or 4 minutes. So if this is your chance.
I see one in the chat, but I can't read it.
Is there, Jack is asking, is there any evidence that the women accomplished their goal? Did any soldier defect?
It's a great question. And the one thing I don't have in this book, I don't have documents from the German soldiers' side. Right? I don't know kind of how soldiers reacted to this, with the exception of saying that that I don't think that the Germans would have tried to track them for 4 years if they didn't take it seriously. I mean, undermining morale was you could be executed for that. That was a capital offense, right, in an occupation space. So it was definitely something that that the Germans took seriously. There are a couple of names that pop up. They actually meet someone in prison. Because there are a number of soldiers who actually get arrested and put in prison, and so they meet a number of German soldiers in prison. These are men who have been engaged in some kind of either mutiny or talk about desertion or whatever it might be, and they meet at least a couple. One in particular that they sort of form a little bit of a relationship with, who has read their notes, and actually when he does finally desert, he actually goes to their house and convinces their maid, who's staying there as a caretaker, to let him stay there. And they sort of write a letter to her saying, let him stay there, because once he gets out of jail, he's going to desert. And so, I don't know how many more there might have been, or at least how many other men might have read the notes and at least had a thought, right? That's something that's unrecoverable in the historical record. But one of the things that is interesting also along this line is that, and I say this in the book, that not all of their notes make it into the, they have this file of about 300 or so notes at the trial, but they produced way more than 300 notes, right? So that begs the question, what happened to all the other notes, right? Were soldiers reading them and keeping them? Were they hoarding them? Were they destroying them? Were they passing them on to one another? It's impossible to really know. So I wish I had more documents on that side of the story. I only have these glimpses. But again, I think, the fact that the Germans were tracking them for 4 years, at the very least suggests that this was an effort, or was an activity that they took very seriously.
Wow, took a lot of guts. Unbelievable. Is
Absolutely.
there anything that you're working on now? Do you have any new projects in the works?
I have a new project. I don't want to say a whole lot about it because it's in such an early stage that I don't want to, I don't want to jinx it or anything. But it's a different kind of story. It's an episode that takes place at the Berlin Wall, actually. But another story similar to this, in that it's the story of sort of a single person who acts with a lot of courage, but that this story sort of opens up, just like Paper Bullets does, opens up into a much wider sort of picture and raises a lot of bigger questions. And really, I think those are the kind of stories that attract me. Stories that seem small, that seem, just about one or two people, but that have these really big implications behind them. And so those are the kinds of things that I seek out. And that was certainly the case with my last book, Paper Bullets, but the one before that, Paris Underwater, about the Paris flood of 1910. That was a very sort of small story about a largely forgotten flood, natural disaster, but that actually, once you start to investigate it, you really start to see the kind of bigger, there's a whole lot of bigger issues behind it. So I don't want to say any more about the current work, just because, like I said, who knows where it'll go, but it kind of fits within the same theme of seemingly small stories that have a lot going on behind them.
That's exciting. We'll keep an eye out, right?
Yeah, well, I look forward to coming back to, and maybe in person, to Delray Beach Public Library and speaking sometime in the future.
That would be great. Well, it's 8 o'clock, so we'll say good night at this point. Thank you very much to everyone who joined us here in this Zoom room, and thank you over and over, 1,000 thanks to Jeffrey Jackson for being with us and sharing this fantastic story with us. It was a pleasure to have you here. Thank you for the gift of your time and the gift of your story. And I hope to see everyone here again sometime in the future. Take care and be well, everyone.
Thank you again.
Good night. Thank you.